Mark Rogers TV back with you to continue our series comparing the conferences. We're looking at the 2014 on-field performance of every Power 5 conference, both the regular season and postseason play, by looking at just those games played against each other. So you can't look at in-conference play. You've got to look at those games that they played against each other. There were far too few in the regular season, but of course in the postseason play, almost all the postseason bowl games were played against each other within the Power 5, so it gives us a better sample. About 20 to 25, close to 30 games per conference against the other four major conferences. We've got a formula here. Check out our video where we explain our formula. We're not going to go through the whole explanation here. We're going to look at the Big Ten's performance against the Big 12, the ACC, the SEC, and the Pac-12. We've already knocked out the ACC and the SEC, so some of these numbers aren't going to mean a whole lot until we get done with all five conferences, and then we knock out a video where we compare the numbers. So let's run through it. The Big Ten, very bad early, those first couple weeks of the season against the other four major conferences. Then, of course, their best teams played really well against the best teams in the country late in the season, i.e. Ohio State and Michigan State mostly, and also Wisconsin. All right, let's look at the wins. So these are the 14 games that the Big Ten won against the other four major conferences and the major independents. So the Big Ten, in those 14 games, the teams that won for the Big Ten were 127-60 overall. They were 70-47 in the Big Ten. So those 14 teams that won those games. So if there are multiple teams, we doubled up on those games. So we counted each game, the record for the Big Ten representative for each game, went 70-47 inside the Big Ten. Their opponents that they beat those 14 consecutive games were 110-74, those Power 5 teams. They were 54-40 within their own conferences, so they were pretty good teams. So this number here is the seeding. So what we did, as we explained in our video earlier, is that we seeded 1 through 14 for the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten, since they have 14 teams. We seeded 1 through 10 and 1 through 12 for the Big 12 and the Pac-12, since those are the number of teams that they have. So they don't have like seeding, so we had to do the math and transition those seedings. So for example, a team that's a 5 seed in the Big 12, and you compare that to the Big 10, you've got to drop them from a 5 because they're 5 out of 10 in the Big 12 to a 7 seed because that's comparable to halfway down the list for a 14-team league. So we base all these seedings on a 14-team league since we've got 3 out of the 5 play 14 teams. Okay, so the seeding, the average seeding for these 14 games for the Big Ten that they won was the 6.1 for the Big Ten. So they were beating slightly better competition actually outside of the Big Ten. The average seeding of those 14 teams that lost in the other Power 5 conferences was 5.7. So the Big Ten was actually playing up a little bit. Again, the average 6 seed in the Big Ten was beating a slightly better seed in the other four major conferences, 14 consecutive games. This is interesting here. Look at the overall record. And I don't put a whole lot of stock in the overall record because everybody played generally 4 non-conference games. And a lot of those games, usually 3 out of 4, were against the American Athletic or the Mountain West, or usually 1 or 2 of those games against lower division teams even. But if you look at that, they are playing generally the same level of teams, because if you take away the 14 wins, this 110-74 becomes 110-60 for the teams that the Big Ten beat, while you take away the 14 wins, and it's 113-60. So they almost played exactly the same winning percentage, almost to a T, and won those 14 consecutive games. And again, they were a little bit lower of a seed. Now let's look at the losses, because the Big Ten didn't fare horribly unless you compare them so far, since we've run the numbers for the ACC and the SEC. So the 13 games that the Big Ten lost against the other four major conferences, those Big Ten teams were 92-71. The two big outliers, of course, are the Ohio State loss to Virginia Tech. Ohio State, a 1 seed, lost to Virginia Tech, a 10 seed. And the outlier for the win category, of course, Indiana, a 13 seed in the Big Ten, defeated a 2 seed in the SEC in Mizzou. Okay, back to the losses. 92 and 71 for the Big Ten. Their teams were slightly over 500 at 57 and 49. Average seed for the Big Ten, 7 seed in the losses. Okay, the 13 consecutive games that the other 4 major conferences won against the Big Ten, those teams were 99 and 71. So they were generally a little bit better, but if you take away those 13 losses, they were actually worse than the teams that they beat in the Big Ten. 47 and 50. So that tells us that these teams in the other conferences weren't that good. They were 47 and 50 in conference, so they were marginal teams. Their average seeding was 7.3. So that's comparable. So that makes sense that the Big Ten teams with an average seed of 7 lost to an average seed of 7.3. Until you think about this. They lost all 13 of those games against what averaged out to like-seeded teams. So it brings us to this. The quality of win, average win, and the quality of the average loss for the Big Ten. The quality of the average win was 10.1. So what we did here, and we explain this more fully again in the prep video, is that we started with 10 points. 10 points for a win, 10 points for a loss. So if your conference won the game, you get 10 points. We start there. And then we factor in the seeding. So if it's a like-seeded game, like the national championship game, Ohio State, a 1 seed, defeated Oregon, a 1 seed. That's a 10-point win for the Big Ten. That's a negative 10 for the Pac-12. Let's say it's not a like-seeded game. Let's take the extreme. Ohio State lost to Virginia Tech. Ohio State, a 1 seed, lost to Virginia Tech, a 10 seed in the ACC. So for the ACC, that's a great win. They get the 10 points plus the 9-point difference in seeding. So the ACC gets plus 19, so that shoots that up. For the Big Ten, that's a 19-point loss. That's a negative 19 in the loss factor. So that's a big loss for the Big Ten. Of course, they had the other outlier, the Indiana win over Mizzou. That was a plus 21 because the 11-seed difference plus the 10. So again, the Big Ten pretty much beat like seeds in those games with just slightly over a 10 for the quality of win average. The quality of loss average, negative 9.8, which doesn't sound bad because you start with 10, so that's a like-seeded game. That's reflected right there if you look at the seedings. The average 7 seed in the Big Ten lost on average to a 7.3 seed, so that's reflected right there. So the lower that number, the better. Because think, if you're losing to like-seeded teams, that's a negative 10. So if it's tweaked for losing to higher-seeded teams, then that's going to drop that number. And we'll go through the individual games here real quick. So the 14 wins for the Big Ten. You had Ohio State beat Bama, and they beat Oregon. They were 1 seeds in their conferences. Michigan State at 2 beat Baylor at 1. Maryland, a 6, beat Syracuse at 13, so that's a good example right there. Maryland, a 6 seed in the Big Ten. Syracuse, a 13 in the ACC. So you get 10 points if you're the Big Ten. But then we subtract 7 for the seeding difference. A 6 should beat a 13. Subtract the 7, and so that's a plus 3 for the Big Ten. So that's going to bring down that number. Rutgers, an 8, beat North Carolina 7. Rutgers, an 8, beat Washington State, and 11, but the seeding adjustment at 12. The 2 wins over Navy for Ohio State and Rutgers. Penn State at 12 beat Boston College at 6, so good win for the Big Ten there. And again, we bring up Indiana, Missouri, Auburn, Wisconsin. Badgers win it. A 3 seed out of the Big Ten beat an SEC 6. It's a very good win for the league overall, but in terms of the numbers, not a great win because that's a plus 7. And Nebraska beat Miami, a 5-11 game. Iowa beat Pitt, Iowa 7, Pitt an 8. And the big win for Northwestern over Notre Dame. We looked at Notre Dame. We compared them to all the Power 5 conferences. We slotted them appropriately as a 6. We went through all the conferences, slotted Notre Dame based on schedule and record, and gave them a 6. Losses for the Big Ten. Of course, we note the big one that really hurts that score. Ohio State a 1 loses to the Hokies at 10. Michigan State a 2 loses to Oregon a 1. Maryland, a 6, loses to West Virginia, an adjusted 8 seed. Maryland in the bowl game gets trounced by Stanford. Actually, Maryland, a 6 seed. Stanford, a much better football team, as we saw in that bowl game, an 8 seed, adjusted 8 seed in the Pac-12. 2 losses to Notre Dame by Michigan and by Purdue. Michigan lost to Utah. Michigan, the 10 seed, by the way, in the Big Ten. Utah, 5, adjusted 6 in the Pac-12. Wisconsin lost to LSU, a 3-7 game. Nebraska lost in the bowl game to USC. That was a 5-5 game. USC adjusted to a 6. Big loss for the Big Ten here. Iowa, 7 seed, lost to Iowa State, a 10 seed, but that's a 10 seed in the Big 12 that's got 10 teams. So that gets adjusted to a 14 seed loss. That's a 7 loses to a 14. Iowa, 7 seed, loses to Tennessee, a 10 seed. And finally, Illinois, a 9 loses to Washington, a 9 seed adjusted in the Pac-12. And then there was also a Northwestern loss to Cal, an adjusted 10 seed in the Pac-12. This doesn't take into account wins that most of these Power 5 conferences just racked up against the lower division teams, the smaller conferences, but also some of those embarrassing losses. And the Big Ten had a few more than the other Power 5 conferences, maybe outside, possibly the Big 12. I don't think it's going to be real pretty for the Big 12 once we add this up. So that's the rundown for the Big Ten. Again, it's 14-13 on the surface, but we break it down and compare the like seeding and make the adjustments for the wins and the losses. Would love to hear what you have to say as we run down. Again, we've got the Big Ten, we've got the ACC and the SEC done. We've got 2 more to go right here on Mark Rogers TV.